The air in the auction house backroom before a record sale hung heavy. A rich blend of aging paper, polished mahogany, and the faint metallic tang of old coins. I ran a gloved finger along the intricate carving on a small, dark wooden sarcophagus, its surface cool beneath the latex. The curator, a man whose passion for antiquities often overshadowed his sense of urgency, hovered beside me, his breath a soft wheeze. He was explaining the provenance, the breathless anticipation of the upcoming bid palpable in his voice. But my mind was already elsewhere. My specialty wasn't ancient art, but ancient lives, or more accurately, ancient deaths. The silent stories Bones told were far more compelling than any auctioneer's patter. My phone, a jarringly modern rectangle in this room steeped in history, vibrated against my hip. I excused myself, stepping away from the hushed reverence of the curator and his treasures. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but the area code belonged to a remote part of the state, deep in the Badlands territory. "Cole here," I answered, my voice cutting through the soft murmur of the room. "Professor Cole? It's the lead archaeologist from the Black Mesa dig. We have something you need to see. Immediately." The voice was strained, edged with a tremor that spoke of more than just excitement. "Human remains. We believe they're ancient, very ancient. But there are questions." "Questions?" I asked, my attention fully captured now. The curator's voice faded into background noise. "The context is unusual, perfectly preserved almost, buried deep, under strata that suggest thousands of years. But something feels off. We need your expertise. Can you get here?" I glanced around the opulent back room, the priceless artifacts suddenly feeling trivial. "Send me the coordinates. I'm on my way." The drive was long, a blurring landscape of rolling plains gradually giving way to the stark, sun-baked canyons and sculpted mesas of the Badlands. The asphalt ribbon eventually dissolved into a rutted dirt track, kicking up plumes of red dust that coated my vehicle. The deeper I went, the more the silence of the land pressed in, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional distant cry of a hawk. My mind raced, sifting through possibilities. Perfectly preserved, and thousands of years, rarely occupied the same sentence without caveats, especially in this environment. The archaeologist's hesitation echoed in my thoughts. Hours later, the dig site appeared like a wound in the earth, a cluster of white tents and parked vehicles against the orange rock face. A small team of archaeologists, their faces caked with dust and sweat, looked up as I pulled to a stop. The lead archaeologist, a woman with keen eyes and a tight, worried frown, met me before I even fully emerged from the vehicle. "Thank you for coming, Professor Cole," he said, extending a gloved hand. Her grip was firm. "This way." The air here was dry, carrying the scent of pulverized earth and something else. Faint but distinct. Something I knew intimately. The mineral tang of old bone. My gaze immediately dropped into the excavation. Below, nestled within a meticulously cleared pit, lay a human skeleton. The bones were a uniform beige, blending seamlessly with the surrounding sediment. They were articulated, lying on their back, hands clasped over the pelvis. Around them, carefully exposed, were fragments of what appeared to be ancient pottery shards and a few crudely fashioned stone tools. The entire presentation screamed antiquity, a textbook example of an early human burial from the region. "As you can see," the lead archaeologist began, her voice hushed, "the stratigraphy points to a period roughly 5,000 years ago. The associated artifacts corroborate that. It's a significant find, potentially rewriting some of our timelines for early settlements here." She paused, her eyes darting to mine. "But," I nodded, already feeling it. I descended carefully into the pit, my boots disturbing only the thinnest layer of dust. I knelt beside the remains, my eyes scanning every detail, my forensic mind already cataloging, questioning. The bones themselves, while seemingly ancient in color and texture, exhibited a peculiar crispness. The edges of the fractures, where the soil had been carefully brushed away, seemed almost too sharp, too defined, lacking the subtle erosion I would expect from millennia of subterranean pressure. And the soil immediately surrounding the cranium. It had a granular consistency that felt subtly different from the packed, ancient sediment in the deeper layers of the pit. It was a minuscule variation, easily dismissed by anyone not specifically trained to read the granular language of a burial site, but to me, it was a discordant note in an otherwise perfectly orchestrated symphony of the past. My gaze lingered on the pottery shards. They were authentic, no doubt, but their placement struck me as deliberate, almost staged, too perfect. A faint, almost imperceptible sheen on one of the larger fragments caught my eye. A faint, unnatural slickness that the dry, ancient earth should have long since absorbed. My internal alarm bells were not just ringing, they were clanging. This wasn't an ancient discovery. This was a recent death, meticulously faked to appear as one. And someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury their secret in the deep past. The tension in the pit was suddenly palpable, a silent scream beneath the ancient dust. My eyes met the lead archaeologists. She saw the shift in my expression, the hardening of my resolve. The questions he had were about to become far more disturbing answers. The bones themselves felt too clean. Not bleached, not scrubbed, but devoid of the usual clinging earth and minute root systems that spoke of centuries. My gloved fingers traced a faint striation on a femur, a mark too sharp, too precise for the chaotic forces of time and soil. The lead archaeologist, a man named Henderson, hovered at the edge of the pit, his face a mask of barely contained excitement. He saw a discovery. I saw a question mark. Remarkable preservation, wouldn't you say, Cole? Henderson's voice was a low rumble, eager, almost as if they were interred yesterday. I didn't answer, my gaze fixed on a small, almost imperceptible discoloration near the hip. A pale, reddish stain. Rust, perhaps. But from what? And why here, buried deep? The soil around the skeleton, though carefully excavated, showed subtle layering inconsistencies I didn't like. A slight disturbance in the natural strata, almost imperceptible unless you were specifically looking for it. My instincts, honed over decades of deciphering the silent language of the dead, screamed. This wasn't right. I need these moved to a proper facility for detailed analysis, I finally said, standing slowly. The air still felt wrong. The silence, no longer peaceful, felt heavy with unspoken secrets. Henderson frowned, his excitement momentarily dimmed. A proper facility? Cole, this is a proper facility. The site is secure, and we have our own lab set up nearby. We're on the cusp of a groundbreaking announcement. The field lab isn't sufficient for what I suspect we're dealing with, I countered, my voice firm. I need controlled conditions, specific equipment. And frankly, this site needs to be sealed and re-examined with a different lens. He bristled, clearly sensing the shift in my tone. A different lens? Cole, these are ancient remains. The radiocarbon dating will confirm it. Perhaps, I said, my eyes meeting his. Or perhaps it will confirm something else entirely. The argument was brief but pointed. Henderson, driven by the prospect of academic glory, eventually conceded, but not without conditions. It was an arrangement brokered by a wealthy patron, apparently, to allow for a preliminary conservation assessment ahead of a planned public viewing of other items. I hated it. The environment was entirely inappropriate for forensic work, but it was the only compromise I could extract. The back room of the auction house was a bizarre place to conduct an examination. Overhead, a single fluorescent tube hummed, casting a sterile, unforgiving light on the makeshift examination table. It was a stark contrast to the open sky of the dig site, and the urgency felt more acute here, squeezed between crates of porcelain and framed canvases. The skeleton lay before me, carefully laid out on a clean sheet. I donned fresh gloves, pulled a magnifying visor over my eyes, and began. My initial observations at the dig had only scratched the surface. Now, under proper magnification, the subtle anomalies screamed. The small striation on the femur, for instance. It wasn't a natural fracture, nor a post-mortem break from soil pressure. It was a clean, almost surgical incision, too fine for any ancient tool I knew. And the reddish stain near the hip? Under the scope, it resolved into minute flecks of what appeared to be modern synthetic fiber, deeply embedded in the bone matrix. Impossible for an ancient burial. My breath hitched. I moved to the skull. I ran a gloved finger over the occipital bone. Not a lethal blow, but a significant impact. And the surrounding soil, painstakingly collected and brought with the bones, was even more telling. Under my portable microscope, I found microscopic fragments of plastic, minuscule paint chips, and even a tiny, almost invisible piece of asphalt. These materials simply did not belong in an ancient burial context. My internal monologue was a rapid-fire succession of questions. How had these modern contaminants been introduced? And more importantly, why? This wasn't just poor excavation. This was a deliberate, meticulously staged deception. Any progress, Cole? The voice belonged to the curator, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper intellect, who had been observing my work from a respectful distance. He was a scholar of ancient history, her skepticism already palpable. Henderson is eager for your preliminary report. The media are already circling. I straightened, pushing the visor onto my forehead. Progress, yes, but not the kind he's hoping for. I picked up a small bone fragment, a piece of rib. This individual was not buried centuries ago. The evidence suggests a far more recent interment. The curator's expression hardened. Recent? Cole, that's absurd. The stratigraphy, the associated artifacts, they all point to an ancient provenance. And these point to something else entirely. I countered, gesturing to the skull, then the femur, then the small, anomalous fragments I'd isolated on a petri dish. The cut marks, the synthetic fibers, the dental work, the soil contaminants. These are anachronisms. Her disbelief was clear, but beneath it, I could see a flicker of professional curiosity. Are you suggesting a hoax? I'm suggesting a murder, I corrected, my voice dropping to a near whisper. A very recent one, meticulously disguised to appear ancient. Someone went to great lengths to bury these secrets, and they understood enough about forensic science to try and confound it. The air in the back room, already heavy with the scent of history and commerce, suddenly felt charged, electric. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, recalibrating. This wasn't just an academic dispute. It was the abrupt collision of two worlds, the ancient and the terrifyingly modern. And I knew with absolute certainty that I had only just begun to peel back the layers of this particular deception. The air in the back room, already heavy with the scent of history and commerce, suddenly felt charged, electric. The curator stared at me, her initial skepticism warring with the cold, hard logic of the evidence I presented. This wasn't just about a misidentified artifact. It was about a profound, deliberate deception. This changes everything, she finally murmured, her voice barely a whisper, the sound almost lost amidst the muffled hum of distant chatter from the main auction floor. Her gaze flickered from my face to the carefully arranged photographs of the remains I'd laid out on the antique mahogany table, then back to me, searching for any hint of doubt. There was none in my eyes. It does, I confirmed, keeping my voice level, resolute. The implications are significant, not just for your institution, but for justice itself. I gestured to a particular image, a close-up of the mandible. Look closely at the erosion pattern on the molars. Superficial, yes, but inconsistent with the overall state of preservation of the rest of the cranium. And here, I tapped another photo. this one detailing the subtle, almost imperceptible striations on a long bone. These aren't natural. These are tool marks, made by something far more precise than anything available in the period your team dated these remains to. The curator leaned in, her brow furrowed, her fingers tracing the faint lines on the glossy print. Her face, usually composed and authoritative, was now etched with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. Around us, the back room, usually a sanctuary of hushed preparation, seemed to press in. They felt utterly insignificant compared to the grim reality I was exposing. "You're saying someone placed these here?" she asked, her voice regaining a fraction of its strength, though still laced with disbelief. "Deliberately? To appear ancient?" "Precisely," I stated, my gaze unwavering. "The soil stratification at the excavation site, which your team presented as undisturbed, shows subtle but definitive signs of redeposition. Not natural sedimentation, but a careful, almost artistic reconstruction. And the associated artifacts, the pottery shards, the bronze amulet, they are genuine, yes. But their placement, their specific relation to the remains, it's too perfect. Too clean. It's a narrative, carefully constructed." I pulled out a small, sealed evidence bag containing a minute sample of the soil I'd collected myself, bypassing the initial collection protocols because my gut had screamed at me. My preliminary analysis shows trace elements inconsistent with the deeper geological layers of that region. A foreign contaminant introduced recently, then blended. A staged scene, a modern murder disguised as an archaeological find. "Exactly," I confirmed, a knot tightening in my stomach. This wasn't just a killer. This was someone with a dangerous understanding of forensic science, of archaeology, of how to manipulate the very earth to tell a lie. She straightened up, her initial shock giving way to a steely resolve. The curator was a formidable woman, and I could see the shift in her. The academic pride, initially wounded by my challenge, was now replaced by a professional obligation, a moral imperative. "This cannot stand," she declared, her voice firmer now, echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. She reached for her phone, her fingers moving swiftly. "I need to make a call." The curator had made her call, and a detective, a man with tired eyes and a suit that looked like it had seen too many long nights, arrived with a colleague. "Detective?" the curator began, her voice crisp, gesturing towards me. "This is Cole. He's a forensic anthropologist, and he's uncovered something deeply troubling." The detective, whose name I didn't catch, gave me a curt nod. He had a skeptical air, a weariness that suggested he'd heard countless improbable stories. "Troubling, ma'am? We're talking about an ancient burial, aren't we?" His eyes scanned the photographs, lingering on the skeletal fragments. "No," I interjected, stepping forward. "The remains are not ancient. They are, in fact, quite recent." The detective's eyebrows shot up. His colleague, a younger officer, shifted uncomfortably. "Recent? Dr. Thorne's team dated them to the early Bronze Age. And Dr. Thorne's team, while highly respected, was misled," I stated calmly, maintaining eye contact. "I've identified several critical anachronisms. The tool marks on the bones, for one, suggest the use of modern implements for dismemberment or post-mortem alteration. Furthermore, the dental work, a specific type of composite filling in a molar, is unequivocally contemporary. It simply did not exist in the Bronze Age." I pointed to the relevant photo, zooming in on my tablet. The image, stark and undeniable, showed a tiny, telltale glint within a tooth. The detective leaned closer, his skepticism warring with the visual evidence. They understood soil mechanics, taphonomy, even the expectations of an archaeological dig. This wasn't a random act. This was planned, meticulous, and designed to deceive experts. The detective straightened, his eyes now sharp, focused. He looked at the curator, then back at me. The ancient discovery, poised to become a record-breaking lot, was about to be exposed as a meticulously crafted crime scene. The perpetrator, whoever they were, had played a dangerous game. And now, thanks to the silent language of bones and soil, their carefully constructed lie was beginning to unravel. The detective straightened, his eyes now sharp, focused. He looked at the curator, then back at me. The silence in the back room stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of the auctioneer's voice, a low thrum that promised the imminent start of the record sale. The ancient discovery, once a jewel, now hung like a lead weight in the air, threatening to drag us all into something far more sinister. "You're certain, Cole?" the curator asked, his voice tight, a tremor beneath his usual polished tone. He clasped his hands, the knuckles white, his gaze darting between the detective and me, clearly calculating the catastrophic implications for his institution. The back room, usually a sanctuary of hushed anticipation before a major sale, felt suddenly charged, the air thick with unspoken dread. Around us, priceless artifacts, a Qing dynasty vase, a Renaissance bronze, a collection of first edition manuscripts, sat on draped tables, oblivious to the modern crime unfolding in their midst. I tapped the screen of the ruggedized tablet I held, bringing up a series of detailed images. I spent the last 2 days processing the samples, cross-referencing every anomaly. The initial field assessment was correct about the staging. The lab work has filled in the blanks. I gestured to the tablet. "Look at this." I zoomed in on a magnified image of a cross-section of a rib bone. The cortical bone density, the trabecular architecture. These indicate an individual in their mid-30s, not thousands of years old. And the osteon remodeling rates are consistent with a relatively modern, healthy individual, not someone from an era before modern medicine and nutrition. The detective leaned closer, his brow furrowed in concentration. The curator, however, seemed to wilt, running a hand through his impeccably styled hair. But the soil matrix, the deposition. He began, a desperate plea in his voice. "Meticulously replicated," I interjected, pulling up another slide. The soil analysis showed a fascinating blend. The bulk was consistent with the reported dig site, yes. Someone went to great lengths to acquire and apply it, then compact it to mimic natural settling. I continued, my voice gaining momentum. Then there's the isotope analysis. I ran samples from tooth enamel and bone collagen. The carbon and nitrogen isotope ratios in the collagen point to a diet rich in processed proteins and sugars, typical of a modern Western diet, not an ancient agrarian one. No evidence of a diet consistent with the purported geographical origin of the artifact. I paused, letting that sink in. More importantly, the oxygen isotopes in the tooth enamel, which reflect the water consumed during childhood, indicate the individual grew up in a temperate climate, consistent with our own latitude, not the arid Middle East. I brought up a composite image, overlaying skeletal markers. The remains are male. Approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, slender build. There's a healed fracture on the left tibia, a clean break, well reduced, suggesting good medical care at the time of injury. Not the kind of rudimentary healing you'd see in ancient times. And the dental work. I zoomed in on a specific molar, showing a clear, distinct composite filling. A modern restoration, expertly done. No signs of wear consistent with ancient diets or dental practices. The detective's gaze sharpened further. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket. A healed tibia fracture, a specific dental filling. Anything else? One more thing. More consistent with a sedentary or light-duty occupation. And there's a subtle but distinct pattern of microfractures in the metacarpals of the right hand, consistent with repetitive fine motor skill work. Think intricate assembly, or perhaps even a sculptor. The detective scribbled furiously, his pen scratching against the paper. The curator had gone utterly silent, his face pale, his eyes wide and fixed on my tablet. Given the specificity of the dental work and the healed fracture, I had a hunch. I swiped to the next screen. A photograph appeared, grainy but clear enough. A man, smiling, his features aligning eerily with the skeletal reconstruction I'd mentally built. Next to the photo was a brief profile. Missing for 6 months. A local artisan, specifically, a restorer of antiquities. Reported by his landlord after he failed to return from a supposed research trip. The detective stopped writing, his head snapping up. His eyes met mine, a silent acknowledgement of the seismic shift in our investigation. A restorer of antiquities, he repeated, the words hanging heavy in the air. Someone who would know how to handle ancient objects. Someone who might have access to the materials. Someone who could meticulously stage a burial. The curator let out a choked sound, a gasp of horror. The implications were staggering. Not just a modern murder, but a murder orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of the very field they sought to deceive. And the victim himself, an individual immersed in that world, now a silent testament to a killer's twisted expertise. It was a strange place for a debriefing, yet the assigned detective had insisted. Crates, some stenciled with indecipherable foreign characters, lined the walls, standing sentinel over velvet-draped tables where priceless artifacts awaited their moment under the gavel. The hushed reverence of the main hall felt miles away, replaced here by the quiet hum of climate control and the occasional clink of a guard's key. "Cole," the detective greeted, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, as I stepped around a towering jade statue encased in plexiglass. He stood by a heavy oak table, a worn leather briefcase open before him, its contents spilling out in a disarray of documents and photographs. "Thanks for meeting me here. Too many ears at the precinct for this kind of information." I nodded, my gaze sweeping over the room, absorbing the details. Every object, every scratch on the floorboards seemed to hold a story. It was a habit I couldn't shake, a constant forensic scan. "What have you found?" I asked, my voice betraying the impatience that had been building since the curator's stunned realization. The perpetrator's audacity, their calculated deception, gnawed at me. "Our victim," the detective began, picking up a glossy photograph of the man whose remains I'd painstakingly examined, was not the unassuming academic he presented himself as. Brilliant, yes, but also ruthless. Enemies? A legion, the detective confirmed, sifting through a stack of papers. Former students, colleagues, rival institutions. He wasn't above using questionable tactics to get ahead or to discredit anyone who stood in his way. He pushed a few documents towards me. There's a pattern, always involving research, publications, and the authentication of ancient artifacts. My mind immediately flashed to the staged burial, the carefully placed anachronisms. It made chilling sense. Someone who understood the victim's world, his methods, would be uniquely positioned to frame his death within that context. Academic fraud, then? I posited, the phrase hanging heavy in the air. The detective nodded grimly. Our victim had been vocal, publicly questioning the authenticity of several key pieces, implying they were modern forgeries planted to inflate the collection's value and the institution's prestige. I picked up one of the documents, an email exchange, terse and laced with thinly veiled threats between the victim and a director at the implicated institution. The language was cold, precise, a war waged with academic citations and expert opinions. It underscored the high stakes involved. Careers, reputations, and millions in potential valuation were on the line. He was close to publishing a definitive paper, the detective continued, tapping a finger on a thick manuscript. A forensic analysis that would have exposed the fraud beyond doubt. It would have ruined careers, stripped the institution of its funding, and potentially led to criminal charges for several individuals. My gaze fell on a diagram within the manuscript, a cross-section of pottery shards, highlighting discrepancies in carbon dating and trace element analysis. The victim, for all his ruthlessness, possessed a formidable intellect. He was dissecting history, just as I was dissecting his death. "This is where it gets interesting," the detective said, his voice dropping another octave. Just before his disappearance, the victim acquired a specific artifact. A small, unassuming clay tablet, believed to be a rare Sumerian text. It was part of a private collection, slated for this very auction. He gestured vaguely towards the crates around us. Our victim believed it was the linchpin, the final piece of evidence that would expose the entire fraud. My breath hitched. A specific artifact, a key to a massive fraud, now likely somewhere in this room or already sold. The timing of his death, just as he was about to expose everything, was no coincidence. He was due to present his findings on this tablet to the auction house's authentication committee privately the day after he vanished, the detective revealed, his eyes meeting mine, grave and unwavering. He was going to declare it a forgery, a cleverly crafted modern fake designed to legitimize the other fraudulent pieces in the collection. The implications slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The victim wasn't just exposing a fraud. He was about to derail a multi-million-dollar sale, shatter reputations, and potentially send powerful people to prison. And the killer knew it. The meticulous staging of the murder, the attempt to make it appear ancient, wasn't just a clever ruse. It was a desperate act to buy time, to let the fraud proceed, to ensure that the victim's damning evidence would never see the light of day. The perpetrator understood the victim's work, understood the very forensic methods that would be used to expose the forgery, and used that knowledge to conceal their crime. The tension in the room thickened, not just from the impending sale, but from the invisible web of deceit and violence that now surrounded us. The implications slammed into me with the force of a physical blow, and the killer knew it. It was a calculated act of forensic misdirection, a cruel, intelligent game. Beyond the heavy double doors, I could hear the murmur of a growing crowd, the occasional clink of glassware. A few security guards, indistinguishable in their sharp suits, moved with practiced ease through the room, cataloging items, their eyes scanning for anything amiss. To them, this was a routine high-value event. To me, it felt like the antechamber of a predator's lair. It wasn't just about silencing him, I said, turning to the detective, whose gaze was fixed on a framed parchment depicting a stylized ancient map. His brow was furrowed, a sign he was processing my earlier, more clinical report. It was about discrediting him, making his claims look like a desperate fabrication. The detective turned, still under their velvet shrouds. Absolutely, I confirmed, my voice dropping, almost lost in the distant hum of the crowd. Think about it. The victim was an expert in ancient cultures. His reputation was impeccable. To simply kill him would be one thing, but to stage his death as an ancient burial, complete with the very anachronisms he was investigating? It's a message. You claim these are fake? Then you yourself are a fake. Your death is as ancient and irrelevant as you tried to make our discovery seem. The detective walked over to a table laden with antique scrolls, his fingers tracing the edges of a particularly ornate binding. So, the killer didn't just understand the value of the discovery, they understood the forensic process. They knew what you'd be looking for. Precisely, I pressed, stepping closer, needing him to grasp the full scope of the deception. The careful placement of the body, the simulated soil layers, even the choice of burial goods. They weren't just random. They were designed to mimic an authentic find, but with subtle, deliberate flaws. Flaws that only someone with a deep understanding of archaeology and forensic taphonomy would know how to create and, crucially, how to hide just well enough to pass initial scrutiny. Not so well that a thorough examination wouldn't raise questions. I paused, letting the implications settle. This isn't a random act. It's an inside job. Someone within the victim's academic circle. Someone who knew his methods, his areas of expertise, and, critically, his impending findings. The detective's eyes narrowed, a different kind of calculation entering them. Someone who stood to lose everything if this fraud was exposed. Or gain everything if it wasn't, I added. The stakes are enormous. Reputations, careers, millions of dollars from this very auction. I swept my hand to encompass the opulent room. Who benefits most from the sale of these artifacts? Who possessed the specific knowledge to pull off such a sophisticated deception? We both knew the answer, at least the most prominent candidate. The lead archaeologist, the one whose career had skyrocketed with the discovery, the one who had authenticated the very artifacts now awaiting sale, the individual whose name was synonymous with the find. The killer wasn't just covering a crime. They were actively constructing a false reality. They anticipated my examination. They understood the language of bones and soil, and they tried to write a different story. It was an intellectual duel, played out over a dead man's body. The sheer audacity of it was chilling. The murmur from beyond the doors grew louder, more insistent. A colleague, one of the auction house staff, approached us, a nervous smile plastered on his face. "Detective Mr. Cole, the pre-sale viewing is about to begin. We need this area clear in 5 minutes." 5 minutes. The clock was ticking, not just for the auction, but for us. The killer was out there, possibly even in this building, watching their carefully constructed lie about to be monetized. And I was standing in the very heart of their deception, determined to dismantle it piece by meticulous piece. The tension was a living thing, pressing in from all sides, a silent promise of confrontation. My fingers, still gritty from the samples I'd handled earlier, moved with practiced precision over the small, portable forensic kit spread across a repurposed packing crate. 5 minutes, I'd told myself, but the clock inside my head was accelerating. I focused on a microscopic sliver of ceramic, no larger than a grain of rice, extracted from the soil matrix that had encased the supposed ancient remains. Under the magnification of my field scope, its surface betrayed an unnerving uniformity, a lack of the natural weathering and microfractures I'd expect from millennia buried beneath the earth. Instead, I saw a subtle sheen, almost a glaze, that whispered of modern kilns and controlled firing temperatures, not the crude open-pit methods of antiquity. A chill, colder than any deep archaeological excavation, settled in my chest. This wasn't just anachronistic. It was a deliberate fabrication. "Anything, Cole?" The detective's voice, rough with impatience, cut through my concentration. He leaned against the doorway, a tablet clutched in one hand, his gaze darting between me and the closed door leading to the main auction floor. The muffled roar of the crowd and the rhythmic cadence of the auctioneer were a constant, maddening drumbeat, reminding us how little time remained. I peeled my eye from the scope. More than anything, this ceramic fragment, supposedly from a funerary urn, it's too perfect. The crystalline structure, the firing temperature indicators, they scream modern manufacture. Someone didn't just plant bones, they fabricated an entire context. I pushed the scope towards him. He barely glanced at it, his focus elsewhere. "Forget the dirt for a second," he said, pushing off the door frame. "I've been digging through the financial records linked to the acquisition of the dig site itself, then cross-referencing that with travel manifests for our primary suspect, the curator. It's thin, but it's there." He tapped the screen of his tablet, his brow furrowed. My attention snapped to him. "What did you find?" The meticulous staging, the careful placement of the bones, the deliberate anachronisms. It all suggested a mind intimately familiar with both ancient practices and modern forensic methods. The curator, with his academic background and access, had always been a strong candidate. The curator, a week before the discovery was announced, chartered a private jet. Not unusual for someone of his standing, but the destination. It was a small private airstrip, barely more than a dirt strip, less than 50 miles from the dig site. No commercial flights go there, no hotels, just a handful of remote cabins in that archaeological zone. The detective paused, letting the implication hang in the air. He listed the purpose as a personal retreat, no other passengers. My mind raced, connecting the dots. a private flight, a remote location, just days before the staged find. It was a window of opportunity, a perfect cover for someone wanting to tamper with a site undetected. And the financial angle? I pressed, my voice low. That's where it gets interesting, he continued, scrolling rapidly. A series of high-value transactions, all flowing through a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary? An offshore account linked to a holding company, which, after a few layers of obfuscation, points directly back to the curator's personal finances. These transactions correspond almost perfectly with the period leading up to the discovery and the subsequent preparations for this auction. Then fabricated the find to sell it for a fortune, all while maintaining plausible deniability. I articulated, the words tasting like ash. It wasn't just a murder. It was an elaborate, cynical con designed to profit from a manufactured history. Precisely. And the digital footprints don't stop there. An anonymous user, but the IP address traced back to a VPN server that the curator has been known to use for his personal research. The post was a query, asking for best practices for simulating ancient bone degradation in varying soil types and methods for introducing specific trace elements to mimic ancient burial conditions. Posted 8 months ago. Simulating degradation, introducing trace elements. It was exactly what I'd been seeing. The motive, the opportunity, the means, and now, the digital blueprint of the deception. It all points to him. The auctioneer's voice, amplified and distorted, suddenly boomed through the thin wall separating us from the main hall. Going once, going twice. For a record sum. My eyes met the detectives. We were out of time. The lie was seconds away from being cemented into history, its value validated by the gavel's final strike. We had to move. Velvet ropes guarded displays of ancient artifacts, each piece bathed in precisely angled spotlights. The hushed reverence was palpable, broken only by the distant rhythmic chant of the auctioneer, a sound that grated on my nerves like fingernails on a slate. Beside me, the detective's jaw was set, his gaze sweeping the room, searching. My own eyes cut through the small clusters of collectors and curators, bypassing the glittering displays, focused solely on one target. We spotted her near a vitrine housing a Bronze Age dagger, her posture regal, her attention seemingly fixed on the artifact's delicate patina. Dr. Reed. She looked utterly in her element, poised for a triumph. Dr. Reed. The detective's voice, though low, carried a surprising weight, cutting through the murmurs. She turned slowly, her expression shifting from serene contemplation to a practiced, polite curiosity. Detective. Cole. To what do I owe the unexpected pleasure? Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, flickered between us, betraying nothing. The question hung in the air, innocent on the surface, yet laced with an undercurrent of challenge. We need to talk about the recent excavation, Dr. Reed, I began, my voice steady despite the tremor of urgency in my gut. Specifically the remains you presented. Her smile didn't waver. Ah, the ancient discovery. A remarkable find, wouldn't you agree, Cole? Set to redefine our understanding of the early settlers. Careful fabrication? The detective interjected, his tone hardening. Reed's eyebrows arched, a picture of offended dignity. Fabrication? Detective, I assure you, my reputation is built on meticulous scholarship and unimpeachable ethics. She crossed her arms, a subtle barrier. Perhaps you're underestimating the complexities of archaeological interpretation. These things are rarely as straightforward as a crime scene. These are a crime scene, I countered, stepping closer, my voice dropping to a near whisper. The microfractures on the femoral head, Doctor, they're consistent with blunt force trauma, peri-mortem. Not the result of post-depositional geological pressure, as you conveniently suggested. I watched her face for any flicker, any tell. There was none. He was a master. She merely tilted her head, a faint, patronizing smirk touching her lips. Microfractures can occur from a multitude of factors, Cole. Soil compaction, root ingress, even the very act of excavation if not handled with the utmost care. A rather bold accusation given our track record. Her gaze was unwavering, cool. And perimortem is a broad term. Without specific evidence of how that trauma occurred, it's mere speculation. You know that. The isotopic signature of the bone collagen, I pressed on, ignoring her deflection. It points to a diet inconsistent with the region's flora and fauna from that period. Not just inconsistent, but radically different. The strontium ratios suggest a person who spent their formative years hundreds of miles from that dig site in a completely different geological environment. Yet you claimed local origin, citing the artifact assemblage. Dr. Reed chuckled softly, a sound that was both dismissive and subtly menacing. Isotopes, Cole? Fascinating, yes, but hardly definitive proof of murder. Ancient populations were migratory. Trade routes, tribal movements, even individual wanderlust could account for such variations. That's a rather archaic view of human history, wouldn't you say? And my claim was based on the totality of the evidence. The material culture, the contextual stratigraphy. Not just one isolated, potentially anomalous data point. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. Perhaps your interpretation of the data is influenced by a desire to find something more sensational than a simple, albeit significant, ancient burial. The detective stepped forward, his patience fraying. Reed, we have reason to believe these remains are far more recent than you've led everyone to believe. That the ancient burial is a meticulously crafted deception. Deception? Her voice remained calm, almost bored. Detective, the C-14 dating on the associated organic material, the soil layers, the sediment analysis, all point to the established chronology. That's a serious accusation, one that would require extraordinary proof. Your reason to believe sounds rather flimsy against a mountain of established scientific data. She spread her hands, a gesture of exasperated reason. Unless you have something concrete, something beyond your feelings about microfractures and migration patterns, I suggest you allow me to conclude my business here. This record sale is about to close, and I have a responsibility to my institution. Her confidence was infuriating. He was using her own deep understanding of forensic science, the very field I operated in, to dismantle my arguments, twisting plausible alternative explanations into unshakable defenses. The auctioneer's voice boomed, a final urgent crescendo. The gavel was poised. The tool marks, I said, my voice rising slightly, cutting through the auctioneer's booming announcement. The precise, almost surgical cuts on the long bones. They're not consistent with flint or obsidian blades, Doctor. They show the signature of modern, finely honed steel. A scalpel, perhaps. A scalpel? Cole, are you suggesting I dismembered a body? That's not just an accusation, that's slander. And as for tool marks, even ancient tools can leave surprisingly clean cuts depending on the bone's density and the skill of the user. Have you considered that perhaps our ancient ancestors were simply more adept than you give them credit for? She took a step back, her eyes holding mine, a silent challenge passing between us. You're grasping at straws, Cole. Unless you have an actual body, an actual witness, or an actual confession, all you have are circumstantial anomalies that any competent archaeologist could explain away. Good day. With that, she turned, a whisper of silk as she moved, melting back into the throng just as the resounding crack of the auctioneer's gavel echoed through the hall. The lie had been sold, and he had walked away, her denial unyielding, her composure unbroken. The detective and I were left standing amidst the hum of satisfied buyers, the weight of her clever denial pressing down on us. The game, I realized, had just escalated. The resounding crack of the auctioneer's gavel still echoed in my ears, a final, definitive punctuation mark on a performance I couldn't quite decipher. The stranger had vanished into the receding crowd, leaving only the ghost of her perfume and the weight of her unyielding denial. She'd sold her lie, and for now, it had been bought. The detective stood beside me, his jaw tight, his gaze following the path where she'd disappeared. But the moment had passed. My frustration was a hot, dull ache behind my eyes. Every avenue I'd explored, every inconsistency I'd unearthed, had been met with a wall of practiced composure or an explanation so carefully constructed it felt impenetrable. The killer was good, frighteningly so, understanding the nuances of forensic science well enough to anticipate and neutralize my every move. They hadn't just buried a body, they'd buried a puzzle designed to defy solution. Yet a deep, stubborn resolve simmered beneath my irritation. There had to be something. No one was perfect. It had been dismissed by the initial excavators as insignificant, just another textile fragment. But its feel, even through the layers of protective material, had always bothered me. Too crisp, perhaps. Too resilient for something supposedly millennia old, despite the meticulous soil staining and simulated degradation. The detective raised an eyebrow, a silent question about my renewed focus on what seemed like a dead end. "Just a hunch," I muttered, moving towards a less trafficked corner near a stack of empty antique display cases. The back room was a maelstrom of activity, but here, beneath a flickering fluorescent tube, I could carve out a sliver of quiet. I pulled out my compact field magnifier, its polished lens cool against my thumb. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, dust, and the lingering aroma of the expensive canapes served earlier. Crates labeled with cryptic alphanumeric codes lined the walls, waiting for their contents to be carefully packed and shipped. Carefully, I unwrapped the linen fragment. The weave was coarse, irregular, consistent with ancient textile production. I'd run initial tests, of course. Radiocarbon dating had placed it within the supposed ancient time frame. A testament to the killer's meticulousness, perhaps using legitimately ancient fibers, or employing a technique to artificially age the material on a molecular level. But the feel. It was still there. That subtle, almost imperceptible wrongness. I held the fragment under the magnifier, adjusting the focus. The individual fibers, twisted and matted with soil, came into sharp relief. I scanned the surface, millimeter by painstaking millimeter, my breath held. Dust motes danced in the harsh light. I saw the expected mineral deposits, the microscopic fungal growth consistent with long-term burial. Nothing. Just the slow, steady drum of my own pulse in my ears. The frustration began to creep back, a cold tendril coiling around my resolve. Was I chasing ghosts? Was this killer truly flawless? Then, as my gaze drifted towards a particularly dense patch of simulated degradation, where the fabric had been intentionally frayed and discolored to suggest extreme age, I saw it. Embedded deep within a cluster of matted fibers, almost swallowed by the dark brown staining, was a minute speck. It was barely visible to the naked eye. A glint, almost like a shard of obsidian, but with a peculiar, almost unnatural sheen. I nudged it gently with a fine-tipped probe from my kit. It didn't flake away like dried mud. It didn't crumble like ancient bone dust. Instead, it was rigid, almost crystalline. I adjusted the magnifier, bringing the tiny inclusion into sharper focus. My eyes widened. It wasn't organic. It wasn't a natural mineral. It was a fragment, infinitesimally small, of a polymer. Not just any polymer. Under the magnification, I could discern a specific internal structure, a crystalline lattice that screamed modern synthesis. It was a microdeposit, likely a byproduct or a contaminant from a highly specialized resin or sealant, the kind used not to preserve, but to simulate preservation. The kind used in high-end art forgery to create a convincing patina, to give an object the illusion of centuries of wear and tear, all within a matter of days or weeks. This wasn't a natural anachronism. It was a deliberate, yet imperfect signature of fabrication. The killer had understood the macroforensics, had meticulously sourced ancient materials or perfectly mimicked their decay, but they had overlooked the microforensics, the silent, indelible trace left by the very chemicals they used to accelerate the illusion of time. This particular polymer, with its unique refractive properties and precise molecular arrangement, had only been commercially available for the last 2 decades. It was their fatal flaw, a microscopic crack in their meticulously constructed lie. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden, exhilarating rush of adrenaline. It didn't just suggest staging, it proved it, pointing directly to a specific modern method of deceptive aging. The stranger's denial, her composure. It all shattered in the face of this tiny crystalline truth. I had it. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The detective would need to see this. We were chasing a very specific kind of ghost. I pushed through a velvet rope, bypassing a nervous-looking attendant, the weight of the evidence I carried feeling heavier than any ancient artifact. My eyes scanned the room, bypassing the hushed conversations and the glint of expensive jewelry. I found him near a display case, his back to me, meticulously adjusting the lighting on a rare jade figurine. Dr. Reed. His posture was rigid, almost brittle, as if holding himself together with sheer force of will. The detective materialized beside me, a silent, imposing shadow. "Ready, Cole?" he murmured, his voice low, cutting through the ambient hum. I nodded, the knot in my stomach tightening. There was no turning back now. We approached Doctor. He didn't register our presence until the detective cleared his throat. Reed turned, his smile, usually so confident, faltering for a fraction of a second before he plastered it back on. It didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, Cole. Detective. To what do I owe the record-breaking potential, they say?" "It is," I agreed, my voice flat, devoid of the usual academic pleasantries. "But not for the reasons you're thinking, Dr. Reed." The detective stepped forward, blocking Dr. Reed's casual retreat towards a side exit. "We need to talk about the ancient remains from the dig site, Doctor. Doctor, I've given my full cooperation. The dating is conclusive, the context clear. You're wasting your time and mine." He glanced around, as if hoping a passing colleague might intervene. No one did. "The dating was conclusive," I corrected, pulling a small, sealed evidence bag from my jacket pocket. Inside, nestled on a dark velvet pad, was a minuscule fragment, no larger than a grain of rice. Until we looked closer. Much, much closer. I held the bag up, letting the overhead lights catch the fragment. This, Dr. Reed, is a piece of industrial-grade polymer. We found it embedded deep within the calcified matrix of the ancient femur. Not on the surface, not a contamination from the excavation. Within, the bone. Dr. Reed's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching. "Happens. The batch you ordered just last year." The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly pallor. The bustling sounds of the back room seemed to recede, the air thickening with unspoken tension. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. It was present in the immediate vicinity of the burial, but not in the surrounding strata. It allowed for quick stabilization of the backfill, making it appear undisturbed. And, coincidentally, Dr. Reed's shoulders slumped, his carefully constructed facade cracking like brittle pottery. The rage, raw and undisguised, finally broke through. "You have no idea," he spat, his voice a low growl. "The sacrifices I made, the years of overlooked research, the petty jealousies, the absolute stagnation. They called my theories unconventional and unsubstantiated. They laughed." His hands clenched into fists, trembling. This was my magnum opus, my legacy. They would have no choice but to acknowledge me then. "So you created it," I stated, the realization settling in my gut like a stone. "A perfectly staged ancient burial, designed to validate your theories, to secure your place in history. He nodded, a jerky, desperate movement. Every detail, the specific grave goods, the positioning, the soil composition. I spent months, years really, refining the technique. It was flawless, ingenious, until you picked at it, with your damn microscopes and your forensics. His eyes, wide and wild now, fixed on me with a venomous intensity. You were supposed to see an ancient wonder, Cole, not a crime scene. The remains weren't ancient, were they? I pressed, my voice quiet but firm. They were recent. A modern burial. The bones. They were old enough, discarded, unclaimed. From a medical collection, decades past their use. I simply repurposed them. He hadn't just staged a burial, he had desecrated human remains, twisting them into a grotesque prop for his ambition. The weight of his words, of the truth finally laid bare, was crushing. The detective moved, placing a hand on Dr. Reed's shoulder, a silent signal that the charade was over. The game, I realized, had truly just begun. I stared at the senior academic, his face now devoid of its usual cultivated charm, replaced by a mask of cold, almost triumphant defiance. He had admitted it, not just to me, but to the two detectives flanking the doorway, their presence a silent, undeniable testament to the trap we'd sprung. His eyes, once glinting with scholarly ambition, now held a chilling vacancy. "You can't prove it," he'd sneered, even as the words of his admission still resonated. "It's an ancient burial, always has been." But the tremor in his voice, the slight clenching of his jaw betrayed him. He knew I had the proof. We have the strontium isotope ratios from the second molar, comparing it to known local water sources from a decade ago. "Not millennia," I stated, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through me. "We have the precise microfractures in the tibia. And we have your digital footprint, the research papers you accessed on advanced decomposition rates, on forensic taphonomy, on the very techniques you employed to mimic antiquity." My gaze swept over him, cataloging his defeat. "We even found the trace elements of the specific binding agent you used to age the textile fragments, a substance not in use during the supposed era of the burial." A colleague standing beside me, a younger archaeologist who had initially scoffed at my theories, now looked pale, his gaze fixed on the accused. The accused flinched, his composure finally cracking. He lunged, a desperate, pathetic attempt, but the detectives were faster. A blur of movement, a practiced grip, and he was secured, his wrists bound behind him. The clink of the cuffs was a stark, final punctuation mark. I watched as they led him away, his head bowed, his carefully constructed facade shattered. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My colleague approached, his voice hushed. "Cole, I owe you an apology. I never thought." I nodded, accepting his words. "The bones spoke," I said, looking at the empty space where the accused had stood. "We just had to listen without prejudice." The detective returned, a small, knowing smile on his face. "Good work, Cole. Really good work. You untangled a knot no one else even saw." He understood the science too well, I mused, my gaze drifting to a display case holding an intricately carved ivory tusk, its age undeniable. That's what made it so difficult. He used the very principles of archaeology and forensic anthropology to hide his crime in plain sight. My mind replayed the initial excavation, the subtle anomalies that had screamed at me despite the prevailing academic consensus. Each piece, painstakingly collected, analyzed, and reanalyzed, had built an undeniable narrative. The perpetrator had meticulously crafted a story, a false history, to bury his crime. He had chosen an archaeological dig, leveraging the very respect and authority of the scientific community as his shield. It was audacious, brilliant in its depravity, but ultimately flawed. No matter how clever the deception, the truth, embedded in the very fabric of the victim's remains, would always find a way to surface. I thought about the victim, a silent witness for so long. Now their voice had been amplified through my work, through the language of forensic science. It was a profound responsibility, one I carried with every excavation, every examination. The bones weren't just artifacts, they were testaments, demanding to be heard. Outside, the first gavel struck, signaling the start of the record sale. The rhythmic thud was a stark counterpoint to the quiet victory within the back room. The world moved on, valuing ancient treasures, while inside, a different kind of value had been affirmed. The invaluable pursuit of truth, ensuring that even the most cunning deceptions could not escape the relentless gaze of scientific inquiry. My reputation perhaps would solidify, but that was secondary. The real triumph was that a killer, cloaked in academic authority, had been unmasked, and a life, so cruelly dismissed, had finally found its justice. It was a testament to the power of observation, of patience, and of the silent, undeniable truths held within the earth itself.